Hey folks, this is Abel James, and thanks so much for joining us on the show. Have you heard that eating animal protein causes cancer? Or that you'll save the world if you only give up hamburgers forever? Despite dutifully reducing our consumption of animal protein for decades, rates of obesity and chronic disease have skyrocketed. In the face of relentless anti-meat propaganda, what if the blanket advice to follow strict plant-based diets is actually accelerating rates of obesity and disease? When I gave up meat as a young athlete for the sake of health and the environment, my results were abysmal. I lost muscle, gained fat, lacked energy, recovered poorly, and my race performance suffered. Since plant-based fake meats and meat substitutes are incomplete proteins that are not well absorbed or utilized by our bodies, avoiding high-quality animal protein can lead to poor outcomes in health and performance for kids and adults alike. Meatless Mondays may sound virtuous, but they're not saving the environment or solving the obesity epidemic as many are led to believe. Indiscriminately blaming cattle for the sins of fossil fuels and industrial agriculture is a mistake. We all want to save the world, but the truth is that we can't eat our way out of a climate crisis. Whether you're raising animals or growing crops, industrial agriculture isn't friendly to the environment or our health. Prioritizing the health of your body and the planet requires that we source real food according to the laws of nature, prioritizing regenerative agriculture and pasture-raised animals over the products of concentrated feedlots and industrial monocrops. When it comes to health and performance, eating high-quality protein from healthy animals is one of the most powerful weapons we have to fight obesity, muscle wasting, and premature aging. Today we're back with our friend Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, a functional medicine physician specializing in the concept of muscle-centric medicine, which focuses on the largest organ in the body, skeletal muscle, as the key to health and longevity. In this episode with Dr. Gabrielle Lyon, you'll discover why what we think of as aging is actually a disease of impaired muscle, the surprising relationship between meat, protein, and cancer, how society's focus on weight loss has led to a neglect of muscle building, which is actually critical for overall health, the most effective exercises and training frequency to build skeletal muscle, optimize metabolism, and fight aging, and much more. Let's go hang out with Dr. Lyon. Welcome back, folks. Dr. Gabrielle Lyon is a board-certified family physician leading a disruption in modern medicine, one that focuses on the largest organ in the body, skeletal muscle, to support longevity and fight back against the threat of obesity, heart disease, and diabetes. Her new book is called Forever Strong, a science-based strategy for aging well. Thanks so much for joining us once again, Dr. Lyon.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to chat.
Me too. Let's start with some of your personal experience with fad dieting, over-exercising, constant hunger, many things that are familiar to the listeners of this show. They might not be familiar with your personal background there. So let's just start right there.
Yeah, well, I will say that I got into nutrition at a younger age than I would say many professionals. I fell in love with nutrition at 17. I graduated high school early and I moved in with my godmother. And if someone is listening and is a functional medicine practitioner, then they have undoubtedly heard of my godmother, Liz Lipsky. She is one of the OGs of functional medicine before it was called functional medicine. And that's pretty amazing. I moved in with her, worked for a room and board, and she was practicing nutrition. I became extremely interested. But here's the thing, and I don't think I've ever shared this. I really struggled. So I was watching her, thinking about the things that she was doing, and I didn't have enough of a grasp of understanding how you put things together. And what I did is I tried to eat as, quote, healthy as I could. I, at the time, became macrobiotic. I was vegan for a period of time, but I would say that, frankly, I didn't know how to do it well. I literally could not stay awake. I was living on Kauai. It was beautiful. I would eat a large hummus wrapped tortilla situation, and I was ready to fall asleep. And that perpetuated over time. And I became hungry, tired, couldn't regulate. And as I learned more, those things shifted. But for me, it was very personal in the way that I really wanted to learn this. And secondarily, I didn't know how to do it well. And that's really where I became so passionate about how do we do it. But initially, quite frankly, selfishly, it was for myself.
And it's so interesting too. My background is similar. It was through trying to be healthy and following the wrong advice that I got sicker faster than my friends did, who weren't really trying at all at that point, especially in my early 20s, all of us, too young to care for the most part. But as we'll get into later in this interview, it's really important to lay that foundation early, or at least make some early mistakes so that you can correct, because a small correction early leads to a complete change in trajectory.
Yeah, I like that perspective for a number of reasons. Number one, habits that we develop early on are very difficult to break. For example, I've been seeing patients since 2006. That is a long time. And as they approach middle age and beyond, the habits and behaviors that they have laid down in their 40s now become extremely difficult to chip away at, whether it's overeating, whether it's binge eating, whether it's drinking, whether it's not exercising, whether it's exercising in a way that isn't effective or efficient for their goals as they age. The habits become extremely difficult. Now, that's one piece of it. And then there's this concept that I created called muscle span. And the other side to this is when you are younger, this is the time to really begin to build up your infrastructure. As you're building up your life infrastructure, you do have to build up your physical infrastructure, from skeletal muscle mass to tendon health to bone health. And if one does this well, the way in which they age, they will have a leg up on interfacing with the world. Truly, they will be stronger, they will be fitter, they will be primed. I think about I have worked with a lot of military operators in my career, and we still do in my clinical practice. We serve tier 1 operators. And there's this kind of idea of farm boy strong, like farm strength. And it's individuals that have begun their life doing a lot of physical movement, physical labor, laying down the foundation. So, one more thing. And the other thing is, when you're young, you have a lot of room to make mistakes. As long as you are active, there's a ton of ways that you can make a million mistakes, and that's okay. But the difficulty then becomes when that window of youth closes, you are now left with either good or bad habits. Yes, they are either good or bad habits. Number two, a foundation of a house that either you're going to be able to leverage or you're going to have to really work to remodel.
You talk in your book about muscle memory, and I've always been fascinated by this because these memories are actually stored at the cellular level. This is one of the things that you bring up, and I've just always been fascinated by that, whether it's related to physical exercise or kind of micro movements. Since I've been a musician for the vast majority of my life, I've noticed that it's very similar to physical training in the sense that if you're playing guitar or you're playing piano or saxophone or something like that, you train up to a level and you kind of like reach this peak. And if you stop training that way, your performance degrades. Your musculature starts to atrophy a bit. You're not quite as sharp. Maybe you're a little sloppy. You couldn't do the things that you could do before. And once again, this applies to musical training as well as physical training very much. But when you basically start that training program again, even if it's been 20 years since you've played an instrument or played a sport or done that specific exercise, all of a sudden, if you put in that work for a few weeks with consistent effort, all of a sudden your abilities start to come back. And that's far different than someone who, for example, never played an instrument when they were young or never played a sport in high school, trying to gear up and get everything into shape in their 40s or 50s or beyond. There are pros and cons to both, though, we might say. It's not all bad for those who haven't done that training when they were younger, because a lot of those, especially as the years tick by, I've seen some of my friends who were pro athletes and really elite level, like you said, kind of make other mistakes like over exercising, getting injured, and those nagging injuries prevent peak performance later. Whereas those who were kind of like couch potatoes when they were younger and haven't been training that way, they show up with a lot less injury in some cases. So there are advantages or things that you could take advantage of to both of those scenarios. But maybe you could just speak for a bit about muscle memory, how that works, and how to leverage that in our own training.
The first thing that I want to say is that it's never too late to start, right? And I do think that keeping this positive and understanding, if someone is listening and just here new and just wanting to learn about health and wellness, and they're here because they don't know much about it, nor have they embarked on that journey, the best time to start was yesterday. The second best time to start is today. It is definitely never too late. And in fact, we see that in the literature. We see that, I see it in clinical practice. We see it in the literature that even if you're in your 80s and 90s, you can always improve. Number one. Now, this idea of muscle memory, we've all heard about this, is really twofold. Number one, it's the ability to and be able to execute neurologically actions. For example, if you take the saxophone and you had learned how to play it, there's this neurological connection. Being able to have muscle memory and say, executing on an action is a component of it. It's not just about the ability to have your tissue respond to load, for example, like hypertrophy. And I think that the biggest component of muscle memory really begins with that motor learning, number one. Number two, the other component to that, I will say, is that if you are well-trained and have been well-trained in your life, there is, again, this continuum of aging that we are able to maintain and develop the health of our satellite cells, essentially the stem cells of skeletal muscle. That is able to respond. This tissue, because it has been trained, will be able to respond. And I think that becomes important because it means that if you are able to train, and for those of the individuals listening who have children or grandchildren, understanding the critical importance of being able to do multiplanar movements and or focus on hypertrophy is very beneficial, because it's, for example, like putting in money into a 401k that you don't touch for a long time. And that's how I would really think about muscle memory. And the fitter you are at one point, say an individual has gone through life and they've achieved a high level of fitness, I think it's always easier to be able to achieve that again versus somebody who has never achieved that or has gone down kind of the path of optimizing body composition.
And what exactly is going on when people kind of get back into the swing of things and start exercising again within their nervous system and muscle? How does that kind of like reconnect and lead to getting closer to that peak performance later in life, as opposed to someone who is untrained?
That's a great question. There's a way in which I think that we should think about this just from a paradigm perspective. Physical fitness, muscle is very divisive in the way that people believe it's just for athletes. And that has really been where the framework has settled. And then you'll hear individuals think about, as they're getting this information about skeletal muscle health and protein, and they're going to say, I'm not really interested in being an athlete. I'm not at that quote level. You hear it all the time. I just want to be healthy. And there is a difference from peak performance, which we all know what that looks like, versus overall health and wellness. And what I believe is that we should always strive to make improvements. We shouldn't be training to get better at exercise, but you do not have to be a high level athlete or even a recreational athlete to be able to think about, how one is going to be able to improve in this domain of life. Simply stated, picking up heavy objects, being able to rotate and twist and pick something up without throwing out their back, being able to go on a trip and raise something overhead, really being able to step off of a curb without injuring themselves. And I know that this might sound silly to people. However, it's only silly until it happens. And when do these things begin to happen? Tendon seems to change, definitely in individuals' 40s. We hear about muscle mass going down, bone mass going down, but also tendon changes. And the difference between peak performance and maintaining health and longevity as we age is critical. And your question was, how do we go from not training to training? What happens? As we age, there's a number of things that happen within skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is important for a number of reasons. One of the things that I don't talk a lot about is this neuromuscular junction. And what happens is essentially it's as if the nerves divorce a little bit more from skeletal muscle. And that is one reason why we begin, at least it is believed in the literature, one reason why we begin to see this trajectory of aging in sarcopenia. The best way to maintain the health of skeletal muscle, and again, there's that neuromuscular junction, so the nerve input. There's also skeletal muscle as a endocrine organ, which I didn't really explain that, but that is, as you contract skeletal muscle, it secretes myokines. It is an endocrine organ. It is the largest organ system in the body. It does a number of things. It is believed that these myokines are maintained over time. The most famous myokine is interleukin 6. Probably the second most famous is BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is released in skeletal muscle based on the intensity and duration of exercise. That capacity of skeletal muscle is the best of my knowledge right now to be maintained, which is interesting, versus the nerve input is not. In addition, the other component of skeletal muscle that changes, and I'm kind of working back around to your original question, which is what happens as we go from untrained to trained. Skeletal muscle becomes anabolically resistant. Skeletal muscle is a nutrient sensing organ, meaning it senses the quality of the diet. Particularly, it senses amino acids. And the major one that it senses is leucine. Leucine is a branched chain amino acid, one of the essential amino acids. The skeletal muscle is able to sense leucine and then begin this process of muscle protein synthesis. As we age, the body becomes less efficient at doing this. Now, the amazing part about aging is that we can overcome this through diet and exercise. We can allow, by our choices, older muscle to respond like young muscle. Once an individual goes for the first 6 to 8 weeks and they're going through this neurological adaptation, they are now beginning to train. They're also, so they're getting this nervous system connection. They're also beginning to turn over their skeletal muscle stores. One way in which skeletal muscle gets sick or begins to look like a marbled steak is that fat infiltrates into tissue. And in one episode of exercise, in one session of exercise, you will begin to utilize these substrates that are somewhat stagnant. And that's really important. That's some of the other things that are happening now is we're beginning to, for example, if you are packing for a trip, and you think of your skeletal muscle as a suitcase. You're going on a trip for 4 days, and maybe you're like me and you pack for 30. You're stuffing all of this stuff into a suitcase. The carbohydrates, the fats, they have nowhere to go. They spill over, they remain in the bloodstream. And essentially, that is what happens to muscle that is untrained or not exercising, essentially detrained. The moment you begin to do activity, is walking enough? No, walking is movement, but it is not enough. I mean, I suppose depending on the pace and if you're, have something on you that's heavy, potentially, but what you really have to do is, from my perspective, is do resistance training or higher intensity say, interval type of session. You really have to put the stimulus into muscle to be able to move that stagnation of substrates out. When individuals do not do that, they would be defined as sedentary, and sedentary behavior is a disease state in itself. Whether you see outward signs of adiposity, if you are sedentary, that muscle is in a disease state.
So, one of the other things you talk about in your work, which I think is so important, is when you're talking about the importance of muscle, you focus on what you have to gain as opposed to trying to starve yourself and lose something or give up a heck of a lot of things. And also you talk about the value of building muscle versus the danger of having a little bit too much bulk in your fat stores, which everyone freaks out about, myself included, right?
Never, it's not, I mean, listen, you mean in terms of trying to get bulky and build muscle? I'm still trying. 20 years
Yeah,
in,
sure.
still working on it.
But if you're going to, so that worry about bulking up too much prevents a lot of people from ever doing resistance and strength training, especially women. But if you weigh, no pun intended, the value of building that muscle, even if that means gaining a little bit of extra fat sometimes, because the way that your hunger is regulated or the way that your life is working, doing that uh, that exercise and focusing on strength training, building that muscle is so much better for you over the long term than trying to diet yourself down and basically sacrificing the most important and endocrine organ that you have, your skeletal muscle, to try to get there. So maybe you can riff on that a little bit.
First of all, that has been a huge disservice to women. And I think it kind of happened the days of Venice Beach, where Arnold was pumping iron. And there became this idea that if you do that, you're going to look like this. And the women, whether they went to Jazzercise or somewhere else, but it really was not a woman focused, female focused sport. It just wasn't. And I think it instilled a lot of fear in women that if they picked up a weight, they would become bulky. And now I will say, I've never seen it happen. And then I want to remind women that the women that have had children, your toddler gets heavy. Your toddler might get 40 pounds. You might be carrying around your toddler all the time. Your toddler that is 40 pounds, and I guarantee you, many of the listeners may not be willing to pick up a 40-pound kettlebell and carry it around all day. I have two very little children. I have a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I am constantly picking them up and carrying them around. I've yet to become bulky, and that's a lot of reps and sets. It's a lot of reps and sets. It is very difficult and takes quite a bit of attention to be able to put on skeletal muscle mass. If you are untrained and your diet is proficient in protein, you have enough, and potentially even, like you had mentioned, even in excess of calories, you will put on a little bit of muscle. You will not put a lot on. You will not look bulky. It will not happen. The other aspect to that is that when you are going through life and aging and all of those things, is that you should actually try to put on as much muscle as you can. It's probably the most important longevity quote hack that I could ever impart on someone. As much skeletal muscle as you can. Be diligent in your programming and your planning for it and your nutrition. Because quite frankly, it doesn't get easier to build and or maintain. It just doesn't. And there was another first part to the question, which I totally forgot.
It's all good because it's an evolving conversation, and just talking about the quality of muscle and the quality of your life is the direction that we want to go in. But I'll just bring up a quick point that especially as you do get older, if you become untrained or you've always been relatively untrained, then lifting up that squirming toddler, or for for us, we have an aging dog that's about 80 pounds, and like I've got to lift her up all the time, moving boxes as we move house, things like that. It's amazing how often people will get injured doing pretty simple stuff like stepping off of a curb, but these injuries can be serious and permanent in some cases. But when you're trained, especially functional training, like so, we were just recently moving houses, and the movers saw my weights, and it's two 100-pound dead bell or dumbbells that I use for deadlifts only, pretty much. And they're just like, "Do you actually lift those? Like, those are the biggest dumbbells I've ever seen." And I'm just like, "Yes, but very selectively and in a super specific way." And I started small, and I've just been kind of like building over time. And so they were helping us move, and I was helping them move. And they're just like, "Wow, every box must be light for you." And I'm just like, actually, compared to when I was like a long distance runner, and 30 pounds lighter, running marathons all the time, not really carrying muscle, it's night and day. Like doing those simple daily activities, lifting things, especially as I look at 40 this summer, it's fundamentally important to me that I try to maintain that as long as I possibly can, because we're looking at degradation over time. That's just how aging works. So you have to work hard to maintain that peak such that you don't blow out your knee, fall off a curb, hurt your back, and have these other injuries that just happen from basically being untrained.
And I think that that's very wise of you, because the biggest thing that takes people out is not a muscle injury. The biggest thing that takes people out is typically a tendon or ligament injury. For example, we see a lot of tendinopathies that over time really become debilitating for people. It truly is not, most people do not go and then injure their skeletal muscle. How often have you heard that? I mean, in some instances, yes, you might tear your calf if you're doing crazy sprinting or whatever you're doing, but you don't hear people being sidelined because of a muscle tear. You hear them being sidelined because of um, a hip labrum tear or a tendinopathy or a torn shoulder, something of that nature. It's not typically muscle related. And your point of what you were saying was a functional training. I think all training is certainly functional. And the way in which we think about it is we don't just think about loading muscle, but we think about loading tendon. In fact, the best physician I have ever heard to speak about this is a guy named Dr. Gerard D'Onofrio. He is extraordinary. I strongly recommend that he be on your podcast. Just extraordinary. I've never heard anyone be able to articulate the importance and how to maintain tendon tissue health. Really, really an all-star. But those are the things that take people out. And what becomes challenging is that we then over time begin to decrease our capacity, that you'll get an injury. For example, I tore my hamstring. This is the never ending injury of forever. I decided that I was going to train for a 50-hour event because my husband, who was a Navy SEAL at the time, I wanted to do it. If he could do it, I could do it. I'm not sure what I was thinking, but for some reason, I thought that that was a good idea. And I avulsed my hamstring. It was 50 hours. I was sprinting. I was training like a crazy person. And that injury has been the bane of my existence. But here's the thing. It wasn't a muscle injury. It was fully a tendon injury. And that, I think, as people are approaching their 40s and as your providers are listening or people are listening and just getting into fitness, the thing that I should probably say more that I don't is that when you are beginning and embarking on a program, yes, you're there to train your muscle, but you're also there to train your tendons and, to also be able to pull back and let those recover. I probably have only said that once before. I should be more responsible.
Well, it's so important because once you have an injury like that, like right now, I have a nagging Achilles thing. Um, you really have to be careful in a way that you weren't careful before, right? You need to lay off of it. You need to practice other ways of exercising that don't inflame that injury or get yourself more injured. It's so important to maybe we can talk about that next. In the case of injury, especially something like a nagging tendon or hamstring, how do you continue to train, um, but also not injure yourself more? That weighing that is difficult.
You have to allow the tendon to recover.
Yeah.
You have to. For example, you are not going to feel as if you are getting enough stimulus muscular wise The way in which you could do that is potentially you could use a device, whether it's, they have stim devices. And again, this is, I don't want to say a bit avant-garde, but if you're really going to get extremely detailed, you're going to embark on a program and then you're going to train your muscles. Your muscles may be sore. In addition, your tendons may be sore, your hamstrings. You might notice that you're getting some elbow tendonitis from a movement that you're doing that potentially your form isn't great, or you might have a frozen shoulder. You have to be able to do movements that do not cause pain. And that might mean that even though you've designed and have a well-designed program, you might have to pivot. In reality, the way in which I would say the best way to avoid injury is to actually introduce training over time and also be astute enough to modify as needed. And if you had asked me that 10 years ago, I'd be like, oh, come on. You're such a boy.
Yeah.
Get it together. Yeah, your elbow is sore. But over time, there's inflammation in there. And that can then progress from inflammation to a tendinopathy, something that becomes chronic. And that will be the thing that will become very challenging. And also, people believe that tendons turn over very slowly. They don't. They actually turn over. So the skeletal muscle will turn over 1% to 2% per day. Tendon turnover might be 1.5%, maybe a little bit less. It is dynamic. There's not a ton of blood flow, but it does turn over. You do have to allow it to repair. I would say one of the best ways that I personally have been able to do that is through cold plunging. Cold plunging seems to really help with that overall inflammation, at least anecdotally, from my perspective, that deep tendon pain. And then it allows me to train again.
I love it. Maybe you can quickly address next some of the stigmas against strength training and resistance training. What many people who haven't participated in that type of training before think about it usually is fundamentally different from what actually happens once you start. So it's easy to kind of judge the Arnolds out there who were pumping themselves, or back in the day, pumping themselves full of drugs or whatever, and doing all of this training and the vanity that's kind of tied up in all of that. But when you look at the reality of what this training does over time to the quality of your life, as well as how long you live, it's not quite what it's made out to be in the popular media, at least.
Yeah, I agree with that. And what I think you're getting at is that there's not that much of a stimulus that is required. Is that kind of what you're
Yeah.
getting at? Okay.
Yeah.
There's a few things that I want to say here. Number one, I want to highlight why you're training. So you're listening to this podcast, you're going, okay, I know that I need to train for strength. I understand that. I know that I need to be able to pick up my kids and do all my own stuff. I think we should take a step back and really identify why skeletal muscle is important, why this conversation even matters. Number one, we have been focused on an obesity epidemic for the last 50 some years. We do not have a quote obesity problem. Obesity, in part, is a symptom of unhealthy skeletal muscle. What we all care about as we're listening to this are health outcomes that we can measure and health outcomes that are going to be meaningful to us. Health outcomes include things like good blood sugar regulation, good cholesterol, good insulin levels, right? We've all heard about insulin resistance. We understand that insulin resistance plays a role in type 2 diabetes, and the list goes on. We also know that things that create abnormal metabolism responses or just a unfavorable metabolic milieu are things that cause and contribute to Alzheimer's disease, heart disease, hypertension. These are clinical outcomes that we can modify. Now, when we think about what is the lever that we pull, the health of skeletal muscle is at its heart the metabolic sink. That means it is the place for glucose disposal. Just like my overpacked suitcase, the carbohydrates have to go somewhere. Glucose is toxic to cells. You need some to maintain appropriate blood sugar regulation, but overall, you have to dispose of glucose. Glucose dominates metabolism. The primary site for glucose disposal is skeletal muscle. One could imagine that the healthier the skeletal muscle, the more of it you have, the larger the place to store it is. Number one, this is true. Number two, muscle at rest burns fatty acids. We've got 40 billion people on statins. Why not focus on the health of skeletal muscle as opposed to go right to a pharmaceutical intervention? That's not to say that there aren't many people that need statins. I can quite appreciate that. Again, I'm a physician currently in clinical practice. Fatty acid metabolism happens in skeletal muscle. We have to have healthy mitochondria to have healthy muscle. It is also our amino acid reservoir. If an individual gets injured, if an individual gets a disease that creates a catabolic condition, we've all seen and heard of cancer cachexia. Cancer cachexia kills 20% of individuals. It might even be 30% of those that get cancer. That is a profound number. That's just one example. We also know that the loss of skeletal muscle is more detrimental than the gain of body fat as we age. Because again, it functions as the metabolic pinpoint, primary, pinnacle, whatever you want to say. Although it seems as if it's on our periphery, it actually is the centerpiece to our overall health, right? Because we care about triglycerides, we care about blood pressure, we care about glucose, we care about insulin, we care about cholesterol, we care about fatty acids. Skeletal muscle is the site that you must maintain in order to be able to have health outcomes that matter. Okay. That being said, we can recognize its importance. Now, as we age, there is this propensity to lose this tissue because you mentioned something earlier that it's actually called proteostasis. So there's this protein turnover that happens. And we actually turn over 300 grams of protein a day. We only eat around, depending on what your nutrition plan is, you might eat 100 grams of protein, which means that the body's constantly reutilizing amino acids or pulling from the amino acid stores that an individual has. Understanding that maintaining this tissue is so far above and beyond being strong. That's like the side piece. So again, skeletal muscle is truly the key to longevity.
And you brought up cancer. So there's been a lot of talk, especially in popular media, around the dangers of animal-based protein as it relates to cancer over time. You know, some people talking about animal-based foods feeding cancer. Your research kind of shows something a little bit different than that narrative.
Yeah, and the important statement there is narrative. The cancer conversation around protein, let's talk about where that comes from. And in the academic literature, I would say that the majority of individuals who are trained in nutritional science, trained in nutritional science, would all support that that is not quite the case. And before I say that, you did mention that I was a board certified family physician. I also did a fellowship in geriatrics at WashU. I did a combined fellowship in nutritional sciences and geriatrics. But prior to that, I had 5 years of professional nutrition training. So this is where my perspective comes from. I think that that's important because I do think where the source that you're hearing information comes from, it does matter. Now, the idea that protein causes cancer really originated from this complex. It's called mTOR. It's mammalian target of rapamycin, formerly known as mechanistic target of rapamycin. And basically, this is a protein complex that is important for growth. Once you stimulate mTOR, it has like this fancy cascade of reactions that happen, and muscle protein synthesis happens. It does a number of other things in various organs in the body. mTOR is in every cell in the body. It's in every tissue in the body. It's in pancreas, it's in liver, it's in, again, you name it, it's there. mTOR's main stimulation varies depending on the organ that it's in. For example, liver and pancreas may be exquisitely sensitive to overall caloric load and or carbohydrates or insulin. Now, in skeletal muscle, mTOR, which is, again, mammalian target of rapamycin, where people say that this is what causes cancer. Number one, we recognize cancer as being extremely complex, a disease of the genome, and also multiple different kinds of cancer. Are we talking about lung cancer? Are we talking about ovarian cancer? I think that we have to really take a step back and question these broad general statements that are being made. mTOR in skeletal muscle is impacted primarily by two things. Resistance training stimulates mTOR, and leucine, which is one of the branched chain amino acids that stimulates mTOR. The idea that dietary protein, which, by the way, again, when it relates to mTOR, it targets skeletal muscle. mTOR stimulation is not nearly as sensitive to amino acids in other tissues. It's much more sensitive to overall calorie intake and insulin. So, from a muscle perspective, if we believe that protein is the root of cancer because it stimulates mTOR, then we would also have to believe that exercise is bad for us because that also equally stimulates mTOR. I don't think anyone believes that exercise causes cancer. I think that the mTOR conversation is an important one. I also believe, and this also shows up in the data, that this is not a protein problem. If you are concerned about the chronic and overstimulation of mTOR, then you have to care about multiple feedings throughout the day that are higher in carbohydrates. That would be my concern.
Now, you also talk about, I'll just share a quote from your new book, Forever Strong. Blanket advice to eat plant-based with an anti-animal spin deserves much of the blame for surging chronic disease rates. Can you talk about that some more?
I think that we are really struggling with a anti-animal narrative. And I do believe that it is unfounded, and here's why. Currently, 70% of our diet in the US is plant-based. It comes from processed foods, processed sugars, carbohydrates, processed oils. The reality is, according to the data, we eat 70% plant-based right now. 30% of our calories come from animal-based products, with nearly 100% of the nutrients like iron, zinc, selenium, B12 coming from that 30%. If we were to further reduce animal products, my question to you, the listener, would be, what are the implications of that? We are more obese than ever before. We have more heart disease. We have more X, Y, and Z. I will also say that red meat consumption is down roughly 30% already, yet heart disease continues to rise. And we have to ask ourselves, the idea of going more plant-based, that will be extraordinarily detrimental, because one of the things that we didn't talk about in detail is, as we age, we typically consume less calories. If we consume less calories, the calories that we consume really matter. How we maintain skeletal muscle as we age is largely twofold: resistance training and dietary protein. Can you stimulate skeletal muscle with plant-based proteins? You absolutely can. Can you stimulate it to the degree that you can with an animal-based protein? You absolutely can. If you are just thinking about protein, you will require more, roughly 35% more, depending on the source. Also, plant-based proteins come along with fiber, which is wonderful, but also a tremendous amount of carbohydrates. I give this analogy often, or I give this example often. Quinoa had its moment. I remember when I was living in New York City, everyone's like, oh, quinoa, this complete protein. And again, you would need 6 cups of quinoa to equal 1 small chicken breast. Can you stimulate skeletal muscle the same? Absolutely. That would be committing carbicide, right? The majority of us individuals would not be able to maintain metabolic health with that kind of overconsumption of carbohydrates. Now, could someone use more process-based plant proteins? Absolutely, if you only care about protein. We also have to recognize iron is a huge problem. Iron is a huge problem for women, for pregnant women, for menstruating women. What about B12? What about zinc? These are nutrients of concern that as the quality of our diet goes down, then we have to be more attentive to the kinds of foods that we eat. Therefore, the idea to further impart a plant-based diet is of great concern to me because we're already seeing, epidemic proportions of obesity. We have tried the food guide pyramid, which is essentially where people are pushing towards at this point, and that was absolutely disastrous.
And the recent focus on fake processed plant-based meats replacing actual meats in the diet.
It's so silly.
But yeah.
Can I also say one more thing? Because we're
Oh,
friends.
please. Yeah.
Is that I truly believe that is a smokescreen and a distraction. I believe that these companies, there are large, when a food is processed, it doesn't follow the same, it's not under the same guidelines for marketing and advertising as whole food commodities. For example, eggs, milk, beef, all of these are whole food commodities that are under the USDA, and they can never say anything disparaging against another food. It is very tight. The regulations are extremely tight. A processed food falls under the FTC. They can pretty much say a wide range of things. For example, almond juice could say it has a better source of protein than milk, whereas milk could say nothing to defend itself. Not to mention the marketing budget of commodities collectively. So all these farmers, all these people put money into a pool to market. They put all the beef ranchers, they can choose not to be part of it, but the majority of beef ranchers and beef producers that are in little farms will pool all their money together. Same with the dairy farmers, same with the pork farmers. Their collective budget is $750 million. One processed food company, like say PepsiCo, is somewhere like $2 billion. So here's what I think happens. I believe that they, depending on the company, truly want to get rid of these animal-based products for whatever the agenda is. Whoever controls food, controls the people. I don't know. I'm not really a conspiracy theorist. But again, I've been doing this for 20 years, if not longer. Here are some of the things that I see is that when you look at the narratives that are being sent out, so you see social media, you see people arguing, you have the plant-based people, you have the carnivore people, which by the way, I'm neither. I am purely a, physician who sees patients, who's been studying this for a very long time. I don't really care what side anyone is on. I care about human health. And because I care about human health, I'm going to share with you what I see, is that you have these two groups and pretty much every nutrition group arguing with each other. And they are educated in a way that they are being played. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency, which does the numbers for greenhouse gas, in the US, 80%, if not a little over 80% of greenhouse gas comes from industry, electricity, and transportation. Collectively, agriculture makes up 9%. Okay? Of that 9%, 3.5% might be the animal-based products. 3.5%. These numbers may be a little bit off, but roughly there. A little bit more for crops. Yet, when you hear people say we need to go plant-based, the argument is it's killing the environment, all of this stuff. and they believe that to be true. But if they cared about the environment, which I truly believe people do, then they would recognize that maybe they shouldn't fly in a plane then. You could go vegan for 2 years and then take one transatlantic flight and it would be equal. We are never going to eat our way out of climate change. Yet, this is the primary war that you see on the internet. And you have influencers that are in the wellness space that believe this message and believe they're doing the right thing. Quite frankly, they're ill-informed, and I think they're ill-informed on purpose because it continues to spread a message.
And one thing that does happen, especially in this modern internet, that really rewards extremism and even non-facts and just kind of whatever is the most clickbaity. Um, I also used to be vegetarian for a time, even tried vegan. It didn't work well for me, but the vegetarian approach, where even if you do believe that, animal-based agriculture is killing the world, different conversation once you start talking about regenerative agriculture and looking into that side of things a bit. But even if you believe that that's true, then going 80% or 90% vegan/vegetarian, but adding in 10 or 20% of like high quality protein just to keep your body going and keep your health, that's kind of a non-starter, right? Because it has to be 1 or 0. You're either vegan, you're either plant-based, or you're not. You're not someone who's just like a human trying to pursue health. So I know that there are a lot of vegans and influencers out there who've like secretly gotten busted, or maybe publicly gotten busted in some cases, eating just like fried fish and pizzas, meat lovers, whatever you want. So maybe you could just offer a few quick words on, there is room in the middle. You don't have to choose one or the other. Your health is more important than that.
Yeah. And also, why are you doing certain things? Is it belief? There's also this experience that individuals kind of refuse to see anything different. And that is a challenge. I'm not exactly sure where that began or came from, but they believe so wholeheartedly in what they're doing that there's this moral compass and this morality. And this has been indoctrinated from the very beginning, right? This is not new. But the challenge is, who I really worry about is I worry about our children. Again, I am a mom of 2 little children, and I'm not concerned for this generation. You guys do whatever you want. I'm really concerned about our children. I'm concerned about the messages that they're getting, because we know that the stronger and the more nutrient rich the diet is when they are young, that has animal proteins and has iron, then the better off they're going to be. As they get older, it improves cognition. There are brain function aspects that will never revert back to what they could have been, or size or bone mass. I am concerned about those messages for our children, truly.
And quickly as well, animal-based protein is fundamentally different than plant-based protein as far as your body is concerned, and how to integrate those nutrients into your cellular structure, your skeletal muscle, and all the rest of that.
Yes. A very basic way of thinking about it is, there's this idea of high quality proteins and low quality proteins. They are purely based on the amino acid profile of these proteins. But again, just thinking about protein is a very myopic way of thinking about it. For example, red meat has creatine and serine, taurine. It also has these bioactives that are critically important. And a side note, we villainized red meat to the point where people believe it's worse for them than smoking. I mean, it's so above and beyond, absolutely ridiculous. And people are not able to take a step back, and they'll say, with the blue zones, do this and that. The blue zones, some of the blue zones have the highest illiteracy rate, the highest poverty rates. They smoke. It's all cherry picked information. And by the way, that's not where we're living. We have to interface with a world where we're not moving enough, where we're up against all of these industrial challenges that makes maintaining the health of skeletal muscle even more critical. We're not, my dad lives in Ecuador. He used to walk. If it was 3 hours or under, he'd walk it.
Wow.
Do you have time for that?
Right.
Like, really? I can't even find my socks. You think I'm going to spend 3 hours walking? We don't live in the area of the blue zones. We're not doing physical, like, we just don't. We need to be able to support a diet that supports us here in reality of where we are. And the plant-based proteins, they're wonderful. It's fine if that's where you choose. The best of both worlds is probably to have a combination of both. But to say that plant-based proteins are better than animal-based proteins is infactual. And it's the wrong conversation, quite frankly. We really have to do a better job at coming together and thinking about this more globally. How do we support healthy aging? The way you do not support healthy aging on a low protein diet. Period. End of story. People will make this argument about longevity. It's not about longevity. It's about muscle span. It's not about living longer. It's about living stronger. There's only one way to live stronger. It's not confusing. It's not up for debate. I mean, if you wanted to do it on a plant-based diet, go right ahead, eat lots of stuff. You have to train and you have to get your protein in. You have to do these things. To demonize dietary protein is insane to me. You know, I'm a geriatrician by training, which means I took care of people over the age of 65 and at the end of their life. If I told you how many people fall, broke a hip, never recovered, just the way the brittle bones, all of these things, dietary protein is critical for all of these things. We have to understand that our choices that we make now become very critical, and we have to have a very good filter against misinformation. And again, that's not to say that you can't have both plant and animal proteins. You can. You do just have to understand the overall perspective of why we're doing something, how we're doing the other thing to make it meaningful, you know? Because again, it's about health outcomes.
And to target those health outcomes, you have some recommendations around how to eat protein, when to eat protein, and the numbers are a little bit different than what you see from a lot of other stuff out there. So, briefly, no matter what your size, you're looking at targeting something at least 100 grams of protein a day, hopefully high quality protein. And the first meal of the day, you're looking at 30 to 50 grams of protein, and also ending the day with somewhere around 30 grams of protein. I think that's fantastic. So, why does that work? Why is that what you recommend?
Well, that's what the evidence supports. The first meal of the day, all the studies, to my knowledge, are done on that first meal of the day. Whether it, again, all the studies about muscle protein synthesis, about food, about its effect on hunger, dietary proteins effect on hunger, everything is done on that first meal because you're coming out of an overnight fast. It's much easier to do it that way, right? So you don't have these contributing factors that are variable, skewing the evidence of the data. First meal is most important. You're coming out of an overnight fast. I don't really care when you have your first meal, but the 30 to 50 grams of protein, that number came from the amount necessary to optimally stimulate muscle protein synthesis, which is a proxy for the health of skeletal muscle over time. You do want to stimulate that. I will also say that if you are young and healthy, the 24-hour intake or the daily intake of protein is much more important than how you dose it. That being said, 2 meals a day will always, in my opinion, be better than one, depending on your age. Again, when you're young, you can do kind of whatever you want. But the baseline recommendation would be 0.7 to 1 gram per pound ideal body weight. If you are young and healthy, it's about that 24-hour period or that day. If you want to lose weight, if you are aging, if you have any kind of catabolic condition, if you are perimenopausal, if you are postmenopausal, metabolically unhealthy, any number of reasons, you start with 30 to 50 grams of high quality protein at that first meal. Now, I will also say the current recommendation, the RDA, is 0.8 grams per kg, which comes out to be, I think, like, I don't know, 0.4 grams, close to that per pound. Again, anyway, 0.8 grams per kg. That number is the minimum to prevent deficiencies. So if someone is 115 pounds, the minimum to prevent deficiencies, multiply that by 0.8 grams per kg, comes out to be around 45 grams of protein a day. That's the minimum to prevent deficiencies. The one caveat I have is that that is based on high quality proteins only. It has nothing to do with plant-based proteins. These numbers, these data points that we've established are only based on high quality proteins. One could imagine that if you are eating on the lower end of protein, then the quality and where your protein comes from is more important. If you are eating at the higher end of protein, say 1 gram, then you can get away with a lower quality because you're overcoming that for the overall amino acid load. That last meal of 30 to 50 grams of protein, you're stimulating muscle again. You're also getting ready to go into an overnight fast. That is the second most critical meal. The second one in the middle, I don't really care what you do. If you want hypertrophy, you'll probably go for 4 meals.
And then as far as how to think about your own schedule, how to work fitness into your lifestyle. I love how you put this: don't set goals, set standards. So on maybe a weekly basis, first you can talk about that, but on a weekly basis, what are we looking at in terms of the standards that we want to set for ourselves?
I worked on some of these early studies, and basically what we found was that you could literally do 30 minutes a day with 2 days a week of resistance training that could literally be stretched, and you would be able to maintain your muscle.
Wow.
Again, that's the maintenance of muscle. So it's not much, but I think that we all have to shift our perspective. Again, we don't have to be amazing athletes, but we do have to think about how we want to go through aging. And unfortunately, as we get older, we have to do more, not less. And the way that I would think about that, the very minimum would be 2 days a week. You're going to hit at least 5 sets per body part, whether that's 8 to 12 reps or 20 reps, you have to go to some fatigability. And I think about this in a number of ways. The minimum amount of time that you should be lifting weights should be 2 days a week. There's no replacement for lifting weights. Or I should say there's no replacement for resistance training. If you want to start with body weights, that body weight training, that's fine. Then you want to move to bands, also fine. But at some point, the amount of volume that you would have to do to go to a meaning fatigable place takes a lot of time. Therefore, also switching to heavier weights, I think, is more beneficial because you have to also be ready to be able to pick up things. You practice for life by practicing through exercise, albeit you'll never practice falling or something like that, but you should be able to practice strength. That would be the minimum. And then whether you want to do cardiovascular activity or you want to do high intensity interval training, I always recommend high intensity interval training. It's a million different protocols that you could do. You could do sprint interval training, 4 minutes of sprint interval training, which is a max out effort. I never recommend that to start with. Obviously, check with your physician. It's terrible. 4 minutes is plenty. Or you could do high intensity interval training, which is what I typically do. Not sprint interval training, but high intensity interval training, 80% of my max heart rate. Well, I'll do the Airdyne bike. I'll do it while I can maintain a certain RPM. Maybe it's 20 seconds. By about 30 seconds, I fall off. I allow myself to recover. I do it again. I might do that 10 times. That's amazing. That increases my VO2 max. It allows me to increase my cardiovascular capacity without doing all this other stuff. The other thing that I do is I wear a vest. I wear something called an Ion vest. It's AION. I don't know if you've heard about it. It is not a heavy ruck vest. It is a 6-pound weighted vest. My husband wears a 12-pound weighted vest. We wear it all the time. It's not heavy enough where it's going to distort movements, like you're walking. If you've ever worn a heavy rucksack, let's say it's 20 to 50 pounds. I used to do that all the time. As you fatigue, your gait changes, everything changes. But if you can add a little bit extra load, and these vests are compression, we wear them all the time. If I didn't look like a nerd, I would be wearing it right now, but I would look really nerdy. My husband was at the pool. He was wearing it then. It just adds a little bit of resistance to everyday movement. It's not just going through periods of discrete exercise, but it's going through micro fitness experiences, right? Whether it's push-ups before your podcast or when we're done with this, adding it into daily life. It's not about being sedentary and then doing some kind of activity.
I love it. Dr. Lyon, what is the best place for people to find your work, your new book, Forever Strong, and whatever you're doing next?
They can find it on my website, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon. I also have a great podcast called The Dr. Gabrielle Lyon Show. I'm on Instagram. I have a very active practice that has multiple providers. Telemedicine, unless you're in Houston, then you come to see me in person. We have a community. We have all kinds of things. The goal is, how do we make this information accessible to people and allow them to change the trajectory of their life? I cannot tell you how many messages that I get from women that are older, men and women, but a lot of women that are now rethinking their fitness journey because ultimately it's their health journey.
I love that. And I love the work that you're doing. Dr. Lyon, thank you so much for spending time with us again today.
Thank you.
Hey, Abel here one more time. And if you believe in our mission to create a world where health is the norm, not sickness, here are a few things you can do to help keep this show coming your way. Click like, subscribe, and leave a quick review wherever you listen to or watch your podcasts. You can also subscribe to my new Substack channel for an ad-free version of this show in video and audio. That's at abeljames.substack.com. You can also find me on Twitter or X, YouTube, as well as Fountain FM, where you can leave a little crypto in the tip jar. And if you can think of someone you care about who might learn from or enjoy this show, please take a quick moment to share it with them. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.